international diplomatic relations, primarily having to do with the United States. In a conversation I had earlier today with His Excellency President Barham Saleh, whom we again are very, very grateful for having had last night as our keynote speaker. Iraq is a great nation with a great history, but today it might be a failing state. So a great nation, a failing state. And Russia, sorry, I forget the last name this morning, in the, there you are. You said Iraq has to work. Iraq has to work. And so hopefully much of what will come out of this conference is also food for thought, perhaps, for policymakers and for civic society actors and others who will have a role in that. The Hiwarat is really not about, it's about reflection, right? And in discussing Iraq, it's not about relitigating or pointing fingers, but it's also not about ducking blame. But we're not here to sort of, the forum here is to really instigate discussions, nuanced discussions, offer diverse perspectives, to engage and understand what happened, why, what lessons might have been learned, and what is the legacy of the war. This afternoon, we have an incredibly important session on the security implications and perceptions. There have been many unintended consequences of the invasion and the occupation. Some might argue intended, and I'm not here to arbitrate which one is it. But you've got Daesh and the rise of Daesh. You've got the loss or erosion of U.S. prestige and influence in the region. You continue to have cells, if you will, of terrorist activity that are in Iraq, but also in neighboring Syria. Those have very serious security implications, not only for the countries, but for the region and for the world, with increased migration that's taking place. By one estimate, there are 25,000 armed fighters in Idlib alone. What's going to happen? What will happen also with people who become radicalized in camps in Syria in particular. There's the question of Iran, of course, and I'm very, very glad that we have Vali Nasser, among others, to talk about that in this afternoon session. There is a transformation of the pan-regional security landscape, and that's some of what we will hear about this afternoon. So I'm going to cede the stage and invite the panelists for this afternoon session to come to the stage. The session is going to be introduced and moderated by Karine Walder, who is an associate professor of international history at Georgetown University in Qatar. She's a close colleague, and I'm proud to say also that because I can't turn my back on my 30 years at Columbia, I'm very proud of the fact that Karine got her PhD at Columbia University, and Karine is actually on research leave this fall. So I am especially grateful to her that she's taking time away from her leave to be with us this afternoon. So Karine and your co-panelists, please come to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Yeah, everybody can hear me, yes. So before I introduce our esteemed panelists today, I'd like to remind you that you have a little card on your table. If you have any questions at the end of their talks, you can text your question, and I will be getting the questions on my phone via WhatsApp. Please remember to just identify yourself, your name, and your affiliation. So now I will turn to our panelists. Christian Ulrichsen is a Baker Institute Fellow for the Middle East at Rice University, a non-resident senior fellow at the Arab Center located in DC, and an affiliate professor at the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies. He is also a visiting fellow at the LSE Middle East Center and an associate fellow at Chatham House in the UK. May Darwish is an associate professor of international relations of the Middle East at the University of Birmingham in the UK, and she's also the principal investigator of the project Port Infrastructure, International Politics, and Everyday Life, which is funded by the Carnegie Corporation in New York. And finally, Vali Nasser is the Majid Hadari Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS, where he was also the former dean. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the South Asia Center and a member of the U.S. Department of State's Foreign Affairs Policy Board. Previously, he served between 2009 and 2011 as the senior advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, Ambassador Richard Holbrooke. So we will start today with Christian, who will speak for about 10 minutes. Everyone will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we will open up the conversation to your questions.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here for this very important event. We're going to speak about some of the regional security consequences and perceptions from the invasion and its aftermath. And in one way, the invasion underscored the vulnerability of states across this part of the world to internal pressure and external shock and the ways in which they intersect. There have, of course, been 3 interstate wars in the Gulf since 1980, the Iran-Iraq War, the 1991 Gulf War, and 2003. But the fallout from 2003 really indicated a shift from interstate war to conditions of state breakdown, violence within states, and the flows of destabilizing activity which resulted. And initially, a lot of the instability bypassed the Gulf states. We saw flows of refugees and within Iraq internally displaced people, but not south towards the GCC. In fact, initially, a lot of the destabilizing flows ran the other direction from Iraq's neighboring states into Iraq with support for radical groups within Iraq and foreign fighters flowing in. It was only later, with the eruption of ISIS, almost a decade later, that some of the flows were reversed. Others have also indicated how over the past decade or so, especially over the last 3 administrations in the US, there has been a perception here in the Gulf that there's almost an incomprehension, a sense of the US foreign policy in the Middle East is something that is no longer as reliable or as predictable as it used to be. And often we hear Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations being at the root cause of a series of decisions which have caused real head scratching here in the Gulf. But I would argue that we can date a lot of this as well to the George W. Bush administration and to incomprehension at the ways in which US policy or coalition policy in Iraq effectively handed Iraq, as I think Saud al-Faisal, the Saudi foreign minister, said in 2005, to Iran on a plate, on a silver platter. And King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia in 2007 was especially vocal in his expression of anger, as he saw it, the perception of the US, or at least the consequences of the US-led invasion and mismanaged occupation. So we see there, I think, some of the beginnings of that divergence of opinion as to why decisions were being taken and the results that were flowing from them. And just on Bush and Blair, we had Ambassador John Wilkes last night reminding us that actually in 2004, Bush was re-elected. In 2005, Blair was re-elected. And I would go further than that and say that in 2004, it's the only election since 1988 where the Republicans have won the majority vote of the last 7 US presidential elections. And in 2005, Tony Blair led the Labour Party to re-election, which until today is still the last time the Labour Party has won a UK general election. So the perceptions, at least in the West, in the UK and the US, that the war was a disaster took some time to unfold. I think it only became visible to a Western public between, say, 2005 and 2008. But we saw the long shadow of Iraq very visible in 2013, 10 years after the invasion, and 10 years ago last month, when in Syria the chemical weapons attack in August 2013 seemed for a few days that it would cross President Obama's red line, it would trigger a Western military response. And what was fascinating was what stopped it was the British House of Commons debate on whether to authorize the use of military force. And I followed that debate. I remember listening to it and being struck by how many members of parliament in 2013 were having the debate they wished they had had with retrospective knowledge in 2003. Many of the members of parliament were the same who had been in parliament in 2003, 10 years before, and in 2013 you got the sense that they were having the debate they wished they had had, and they voted not to authorize the use of military force. Another of the results, another of the perceptions as well as reality, was of course the increasing atmosphere of sectarian tension and what some scholars have called the new Cold War, especially between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We saw within that atmosphere play out some of the policy responses to the Arab Spring, the upheaval in 2011, again play out within that framework of a sectarian prism, a sectarian policy response. And of course the war in Yemen, the internationalization of the war in Yemen in 2015 and all of its consequences still are with us today, again in an atmosphere of a zero-sum game mentality which had developed post-2003. And I hardly need to remind this audience here in Doha of the ways in which accusations of proximity to Iran were used in 2017 as one of the pretexts for cutting diplomatic relations and imposing a political and economic blockade or boycott of Qatar by neighboring states. Now, things have changed, and I would argue that the 14th of September 2019, 4 years ago yesterday, will in future be seen as a critical turning point, just as 2003 was a hinge in one direction. 2019, the attack on Abqaiq and Khurais in Saudi Arabia and the lack of an overt US policy response really punctured the assertive bubble that had developed in so much of regional states' foreign policy making especially post-2011. I think the Abqaiq attack, the response or lack of, really slowed and perhaps reversed the sense over 2 decades, more than 2 decades, that the GCC states were being integrated into the US-led military and security umbrella, and that strategic and security interests had converged. And we've seen since 2019 a real move to try to internationalize security and defense relationships and a real move towards de-escalation in tension in the region. So finally, here we are today in 2023 in a very different strategic and security context and environment. We've had the ends of the US so-called forever war in Afghanistan, and I think certainly from a US point of view, the end of the war in Afghanistan, the chaotic withdrawal in 2021, marked the closing of the page of that chapter of US policy, which began after 2001 with the war on terror, the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq. I get the sense, especially from following the commemorations of the 20th anniversary this year, that people in the US have sort of moved on, regardless of the horror, the devastation that they have inflicted in Iraq and, of course, in Afghanistan. The notion that US marked 20 years of 9/11 with the Taliban once again in control of Afghanistan was powerfully symbolic. We see the drawdown from the abnormally high US troop levels post-2001, perhaps a reversion to the long-term mean. But again, that drawdown has again stirred concern about long-term durability of the US presence. We see a new phase now of Saudi-Iran reconciliation. The China brokered restoration of relations actually made reference to agreements in 1998 and 2001, agreements that were then derailed by 2003 and everything that flowed from it. So it's almost like we've come full circle back to 1998, 2001, that period. We also see new entrants to regional security: Turkey, China, Israel, of course, with the Abraham Accords. And here we are today, 20 years on, another war of choice being waged, this time by Russia in Ukraine. And that war, above all, I think, has underscored the multipolarity of regional and international responses in ways that are going to make sure that the next decade will be very different from the 2 decades that we've just witnessed. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today. So in my very brief contribution today, I'm going to be trying to talk more about the implications of the war and the long consequences that the war had on regional and international dynamics. At the very beginning of the war, the US decision makers thought and predicted that the war is going to be very, very short. Rumsfeld in 2002 said, and I quote, "The Gulf War of the 90s lasted 5 days on the ground. I can tell you that if the use of force in Iraq today would last 5 days or 5 weeks or 5 months, but I certainly isn't going to last any longer than that." Obviously, they were all very wrong. 2 decades later, the killings continue in Iraq, and Iraq is still effectively at war. So the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War is certainly providing little cause for celebration, but it offers a small opportunity for us to reflect on the consequences, reflect on how the war has shaped many of the dynamics that we see today in the region. Very important to note that these long-term consequences have been overshadowed by the Arab uprisings and its aftermath, including the wars in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, and more recently in Sudan, and also the return of authoritarianism in the region. Nevertheless, the Iraq War remains a defining moment and remains a critical juncture that has shaped even how the uprisings unfolded, how different regional actors and international actors responded to the uprising. So I'm going to be limiting my comments to 3 main points to show how the Iraq War and its aftermath have even shaped the development of the region, especially after 2011. So the first point is about the US, and the Iraq War has somewhat ended an era of US hubris about the promotion of democracy in the Middle East. So American hegemony in the post-Cold War era was basically aimed at changing the course of events in the region, reshaping the borders, and changing some of the dynamics to suit the US agenda on many levels. Somehow that failed completely, and also the US plan that were put in 2002 even stopped after Iraq. Initially, there was a plan to continue and change the regime in Syria to Lebanon, eradicate Hezbollah, and change the Middle East into what Condoleezza Rice later on named the New Middle East. Obviously, all of these expectations and all of these plans were totally unrealistic, but they also had very long repercussions on how the US has changed its policies in the MENA region afterwards, but also globally. Obviously, these plans created some sort of resistance from Syria, resistance from Iran, resistance from Hezbollah, creating an axis in the region that started somehow making the mission of the US much harder, but also weakening the moderate Arab state or the so-called moderate Arab states of the time on the long term. So somehow this agenda of democracy promotion came to a halt with the very high cost of the Iraq War for the US, but also for other regional actors. When the uprisings broke out in 2011, the US very quickly made a decision to intervene in Libya to also change the course of the uprisings in Libya. Somewhat, the result was not very different to what happened in Iraq, but even more disastrous for the US at the domestic level. Obviously, this was the beginning of what has been called the hegemonic retreat of the US. It became very clear that the US and its policies of direct intervention is not successful. Unsurprisingly, for many social scientists, these kind of intervention never succeeded in history. Most international interventions failed to achieve their goals, but decision makers didn't really consult history before making these decisions. Somewhat, it became very clear that the Iraq War had this defining impact on how the US, especially under presidency of Barack Obama, decided to change its decision, change its approach in the Middle East. In 2013, Obama came very close to making a decision to attack the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and on the last minute, they changed their minds. Obviously, the memory of the Iraq War and the history of failure of intervention in Iraq was very decisive in that decision. The second implication that came from the Iraq War was actually making the region more conflict-prone and unstable. The Iraq War kind of opened the door for the post-Cold War era dynamics to come to the Middle East. At the end of the Cold War, there was a spike in civil wars in Africa, a spike of civil wars in Eastern Europe, but somewhat this didn't really transfer directly to conflict in the Middle East. But 10 years later, after 2003, with the Iraq War, the strategies that were used in that period in civil wars in terms of using proxies, building networks of non-state actors became or was transferred to the region through the Iraq War. Syria started supporting many militias in Iraq to make the mission harder for the US. Iran did the same, and the network of proxies grew, as well as the US also decided to support and indirectly support some group to lower its cost in the war. Obviously, this network of proxies ended up with the rise of ISIS, but also with the proliferation of armed non-state actors in the region. After 2011, when other wars broke out in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, the proxy strategy was also employed. It became very clear for regional actors that directly intervening can be very costly. But instead, they started building their networks of proxies across the region. This has very, very large repercussions on the strong or the weakness, the strength and the weakness of the state in the Middle East. And obviously, this has been a long-term consequence for the Iraq War. The third implication that the war has created, it provided an opportunity structure for regional actors. And yesterday, I've heard a lot, many talking about the change in the balance of power, the change in the structure of the region. And even though this is true that the physicality of this balance of power has changed with the decline of Iraq, but also it's not just the balance of power, it's the ideas and the perception of regional actors of what the balance of power is. And in my work, I'm more interested in how these ideas shape perception. The physical reality is not as such important, but how actors perceive this reality is crucial in how they decide to behave and react to certain events. So obviously, the Iraq War created this perception that the region is changing. And obviously, it was an opportunity for many actors in the region to ascend or think that they could ascend the hierarchy in the region. Some small powers, some middle powers saw this as an opportunity to create change, to change somewhat their position, their status, and their role in the system. With the Arab uprising, this opportunity became even bigger for other actors, seeing that, for example, Egypt is somewhat very busy with its domestic level, it's weakening its role at the regional level, but also with several civil wars breaking out, we've seen how Saudi Arabia, how the UAE became even eager to play a bigger role in the region. Somewhat, this perception doesn't mean that it's true or that these actors are capable of filling this void, but it definitely created competition and it created some sort of instability as to what is the final balance of power that will unfold in the region. To conclude this, it's hard to isolate Iraq from what happened in the Middle East the 20 years later. And obviously, the uprisings were not triggered by the Iraq War, but how actors responded to the uprisings is definitely connected to the implications of the war. Also, I would like to highlight that even though we look at Iraq as a defining moment, it's definitely not unique in the region. And in social sciences in general, we're more interested in the particularities of events, but as we're living those events, sometimes it's very easy to think that they're very unique or they're not replicable elsewhere, but the Iraq War can find some of the dynamics in the history, and if we look very closely to the history of the region or other regions, we can see that the same dynamic can exist elsewhere. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Let me begin by thanking Georgetown Doha for inviting us here, and Dean Masri, and also Director of CERIS, Zahra Babar, for putting this conference together. It's really good to be with colleagues and be talking about this important issue, which, as was mentioned last night, is somewhat forgotten back in the United States at multiple levels. So I would like to add to the excellent analysis of my colleagues here, and particularly take a look at sort of in much more grander way, what does this war and its legacy mean for the changing dynamic of regional security? The United States arrived at the juncture of the invasion of Iraq at a time when still a great deal of focus of Middle East policy for the United States, or perception of the Middle East, was about the Arab-Israeli issue and the Levant, which was really what Middle East was when I was a graduate student. If you did Middle East, meant you did Arab-Israeli war. So this was an inflection point where attention shifted, or was a realization that the Middle East, the center of gravity of the Middle East in terms of interest of the United States, has really decisively shifted from the Levant and the Arab-Israeli issue now to the Gulf region and to where we are. And this actually has persisted. And this is, in a way, the Iraq war marked, if you would, a sort of a new phase in American foreign policy. Secondly, the United States arrived at a time when there was a perception at the war, with a perception that there was a successful policy of containment. This had been established in 1979 with the so-called Carter Doctrine, which the United States will defend its vital interests against any outside force with military presence in the region. And it created an alliance of Arab dictatorships, if you want, a moderate Arab, not all of them were moderate, but like Iraq was part of that formula. Even though it didn't have relationship with Washington, other Arab governments managed it. But there was the United States successfully created an Arab Great Wall of China around Iran, in which Iraq was actually absolutely pivotal, because it had the largest military. It actually went to war with Iran, and in the end, it did succeed in winning that war, at least come out of it victorious. And it was really the sort of the sharp edge of, if you would, an Arab containment of Iran in this region. And so this was a successful policy. This is the way the United States saw management of regional security. It was a tight Arab-American alliance to contain Iran. And then, after Saddam invaded Kuwait, which sort of disturbed this balance, the United States also had a successful containment strategy of Iraq. It was called actually dual containment, of containing both countries at the same time, and it stepped up its own military presence in the region for that. In a way, as it was mentioned last night, the containment of Iraq was not working. The United States was grinding Iraqi economy and Iraqi society into dust, but Saddam Hussein was still sitting there. Whether he was building nuclear weapons or not is essentially immaterial to this conversation, in the sense that the United States understood he's not going anywhere. This is not going to change anything. And in fact, the Iraq war was a realization that Iraq needs a final solution. final solution does not mean rehabilitation of Saddam, the way that we are now rehabilitating Bashar Assad. At that point in time, that was inconceivable. So final solution in Iraq means that you need to go and remove him because sanctions are not removing him, and his own people are not capable or willing to remove him. Secondly, the Iraq war came, as we know, after 9/11. And the perception of a final solution was also, there is a final solution for Islam, which, as my colleague said, was put in this context that if we take Saddam out, if we build a democracy in Iraq, then there would be, if you would, a contagion effect, a demonstration effect. The whole region will become democratic. There will be no problem of Islamism. And you will use sort of military operations like a sharp scalpel of a surgeon and remove everything bad in the region. And we don't need to go into how many misperceptions and bad assumptions were built into this way of thinking. Least of all, at a strategic level, it was inconsistent because the idea of promotion of democracy targeted all of our allies. And to me, I think the paradox of Condoleezza Rice giving a speech on America's new policy in Cairo as the guest of President Mubarak really spoke to this. And she angered her guests greatly by basically talking about how dictatorship was a problem when all of America's allies would fit into that category. So in a way, the war essentially was an adoption of the idea of final solution instead of containment. I mean, if we want to look back and say, when did the containment strategy in the Middle East begin to unravel? It began to unravel in Washington in 2003, when the United States no longer saw it as necessary for long-term future management of the region and was looking to a final solution. Now, we know the war happened, as was very clearly said. It didn't turn out as the Washington has anticipated. The military part did. In other words, you could dismantle the Iraqi military and be in Baghdad in record time, but it actually proved to be more of an imperial overreach in the end for the United States. Now, there are significant consequences, obviously, for Iraqis, for the region, for many things, but I want to just say sort of more broadly from where I'm sitting, what did it mean strategically? First of all, the United States' intention was that it would go into Iraq with a final solution, and then it would follow it into Iran. I mean, it was a saying in Washington then that anybody can go to Baghdad, but real men go to Tehran. And, or today Baghdad, tomorrow Tehran, which, the Iranians understood this very well, and it has colored the way in which they look at US presence in the region from that point on. In other words, Iran's policy that Iran is ultimately only secure when the United States leave the region really goes to 2003. We don't want them on our borders. We don't want their soldiers here, that the only safety is there, because this ultimately is the United States policy. Well, the United States never got to go to Iran after Iraq because it sort of put its foot in such thick mud in Iraq that it couldn't lift it again. But it actually had the opposite effect. In other words, destroying the sort of the centerpiece of the Arab containment of Iran, its most important military base, the country that actually was most vulnerable to Iranian influence because of its majority Shia population, and then under the guise of occupation of Iraq, shattering the Iraqi state. In other words, dismantling its military, dismantling its bureaucracy, not being able to establish law and order as the country was looted, creating circumstances that led to actually a sectarian civil war. In other words, the sanctions that already pulverized Iraqi society, and the American occupation actually saw to pulverization of whatever remained of society for a period, and then whatever remained of the state for a period. And this basically meant that Iraq was essentially helpless, and the political transition obviously would empower the majority of the population through the vote, which were Shias. And I do think the Arab states around Iraq made a big mistake of playing into this sectarian issue, not recognizing the new Iraqi government, not treating the new Iraqi government as if it was an Arab government, only made the Shias in Iraq reliant on Iran at a very critical point in time. And the Iranians, not just militarily through militias and IRGC, et cetera, but culturally, historically, began to essentially create deep embedded sets of relationships with the Iraqis. So you ended up creating, if you would, a cultural, economic, military, political zone that now crosses the boundaries of the Arab world and Iran. It's sort of a Mesopotamia world, to borrow Barham Saleh's term from yesterday. So if Washington was thinking about containment of Iran, it now actually, Iran was deep into the containment zone in the Arab world. And then, Syria and Lebanon, et cetera, would create what King Abdullah of Jordan once talked about as a Shia crescent. And the headache, if you would, of Iran's presence in the Arab world essentially was facilitated by the mistaken idea that Iraq would dismantle Iran rather than the Iraq war will dismantle the Arab alliance against Iran. The second problem was that the Iraq war was no solution to Islamism. Islamism did not dissipate, not only because there was no democracy, but actually because of everything that was said. Particularly my colleague from Birmingham said that the sense of it actually jump-started much more anti-imperialism and anti-Americanism at a very popular level. The Middle Easterners, much more so than the Americans, were aware of the killings on the streets, of what happened to Iraq, of the misperceptions that led to the war. Even the Arab governments, who usually try to contain this kind of anti-Americanism at home, were themselves hugely angry and joined into the criticism. And the result was that actually Islamists found a lot more receptive audience across the board for arguing that they are the forefront of anti-imperialism. It's not just about Sharia. It's about what Islamists represent to average Muslims. It's about being anti-American, and anti-American not just culturally, but anti-American imperial policies, right? And that actually found much greater audience, not just in the Middle East and the Muslim world, but also in Europe, among Muslims in Europe, in the United States, all of which we later on saw in the explosion of ISIS on the ground. I mean, the idea that you would have a non-state actor essentially creating a caliphate, carving out two of the Middle East's most important states, I mean, the seats of even historically of Umayyad and Abbasid empires, is sort of, it's just sort of talked about how much Iraq was the beginning of the shattering of the Arab world, from which actually it has not recovered as we are speaking. Iraq and Syria are only a shade of what they were. And thirdly, and I think this is much more important in the long term, is that the Iraq war exhausted the United States, not just exhausted its military, exhausted the American people. If American presidents have adopted different strategies, if you have now 3 presidents in a row, both Democratic and Republican, are averse to war, is because their ear is to the ground. They know that the American people don't want to go. It was said that in critical states that Hillary Clinton lost to President Trump in 2016, where these were states with higher number of veterans who had served in Iraq. They voted for Trump not out of ideology, because they didn't want another hawk in the White House who might get the United States into another war. They liked Trump's anti-war rhetoric, right? So that tells you about the fact that if the 1990 war against Kuwait, against Iraq and Kuwait, gave the Americans the sense that war is easy, it's jingoistic, that war can be a scalpel to solve problems, the Iraq war convinced them that, $3 trillion between these two wars, a mess that speaks to incompetence, bad strategic thinking, not knowing what you're dealing with, and the consequences of the war is not something the American people want again. Now, this has implications, not just for the Middle East. It has implications. There's probably, you could say, that Russia would not have risked going into Ukraine if it was absolutely sure that it's not going to be confronting American boots on the ground. Or the Chinese may make the same kinds of calculations. And above all, the Iranians made this calculation, that the Americans will huff and puff now, but after Iraq in 2003, they're not going to go to war. And they have been proven correct. Like when during the President Trump's administration, this is the most hawkish president since George Bush, particularly on Iran, that when the Iranians shut down a very expensive American drone, which was very daring act, supposedly American jet fighters were locked and loaded on board of aircraft carriers ready to take off when President Trump blinked, supposedly because 157 civilians may get killed. I didn't know he had such a soft heart. But in reality, everybody in Tehran, in Riyadh, in Doha, they saw that what happened in Iraq had truly changed the United States. And then that continued. So when in retaliation for the killing of General Soleimani, Iran launched dozens of missiles on the Al-Assad base in Iraq. The United States forces have never been hit with more missiles ever. Not in World War I, not in Vietnam, ever. And the United States' answer was nothing. President Trump just said, maybe some people got headaches, right? And that basically told you that the Iraq war was such a bitter pill that it's not going to be repeated. And as was mentioned, the point was driven home further with the Iranian attack on Abqaiq. That actually was not so much a signal to the US, but actually was a way in which the Iranians wanted to prove to the Saudis the same point. They're not going to come to defend you. And Abqaiq actually was essentially the end of the Carter Doctrine. I mean, if you can basically knock off half of Saudi Arabia's oil production for a period of time, threaten global energy supplies, attack vital interests of a critical ally, and the United States won't do anything, then there is no more Carter Doctrine. There is no more US, essentially, presence in the Middle East in that sense. And I was mentioned, the Saudi relationship, this decision that they're going to basically no longer follow an American strategic doctrine in this region. In other words, there's an American alliance, to contain Iran, but they're going to actually build their own strategic doctrine. Whatever it is that Saudi Arabia is going to have a different kind of a strategy about how you manage Iran than the one that had been in place since 1979. That is going to handle Israel differently. That is going to handle China differently. That Saudi Arabia is going to be more of a non-aligned country than it was going to be a client of the United States. And so what we're seeing at play is essentially the United States trying to find its footing in this region without containment, without that kind of a military, if you would, presence that it had. So what we've been witnessing essentially since 2003 to this day is really a post-containment era. I mean, it's much more than about Iraq. It's about, we've been in a transition phase, and there hasn't been an actual settlement about, where does the dust settle? And we still don't know, what would be the shape of regional security going forward. The idea of military intervention, I was mentioned, has failed. The idea of containment of Iran in the old way has failed. It's now very clear that the United States will not go to war in the Middle East at all, unless for some reason it is directly confronted. Now, whether it would go to war in the Middle East with China over US-China sets of issues is something for the future. But it definitely is very clear that after Iraq, it's not going to get its hands dirty in the region. So what does regional security mean without the United States actually be willing to do that? And that's really the big question post-Iraq, which still has to be answered.
Okay, so we have a series of questions here. We have two. I'm going to start with two anonymous questions. We don't have a very brave audience, I see. What is the rationale behind targeting certain countries with weapons of mass destruction and not others? And I think here they mean targeting certain countries that are, accused of having weapons of mass destruction. And the second question, to what extent did the Iraq invasion influence the formation of alliances and partnerships among Middle Eastern countries for security cooperation? So maybe we can start with Christian and then move on.
Well, I think the issue of weapons of mass destruction was really driven home by the fact that certain countries were targeted, others weren't. And of course, the failure to find an WMD in Iraq, I think, and Gaddafi, Libya's decision to give up his own WMD in the immediate aftermath of 2003, around 2005, 2006, the fact that Gaddafi was then taken out, I think, was another powerfully symbolic effect that countries that do have, or at least have the potential to perhaps go for a weapon of mass destruction, have maybe a layer of additional protection against such activity. So I think there we see also the legacy of Iraq. And again, also in 2013, it wasn't just Iraq that people were reacting against. It was also the intervention in Libya in 2011 that was perhaps seen as overly hasty in certain capitals, especially ones that began to degenerate in terms of the security situation. But certainly Gaddafi's policy change, which was, I think, linked to the determination to take action in Iraq, did therefore have consequences further down the line. In terms of alliances and partnerships, I think we're seeing now these moves towards a post-American regional security alignment, whatever that may mean. And we're seeing now perhaps a delayed reaction, a delayed response to these dynamics that my fellow panelists have really driven home in their remarks. And a post-American Gulf, a post-American Middle East, will, I think, be much more balanced in many ways, in the sense that you can't imagine perhaps another external actor taking sides so consistently in any one regional conflict that the US has done, for example, against Iran since 1979. And a decision by Saudi Arabia and Iran to involve China in bringing their restoration over the line, I think, sent a very strong message that this age of de-escalation is here to stay, and that it's in other countries' interests, China's, Saudi, Iran, not to follow any potential escalation driven by US or Israel or other states towards a confrontation. So I think we're in a very different phase.
On the weapons of mass destruction, I think, and I think this is also not just my view, it has been also a view of many scholars and analysts, that it was more used as a justification rather than an actual driver behind the Iraq war. So the weapons of mass destruction have been used by the US as a threat, or as a way of showing how Iraq is a threat to global politics, not just to the Middle East. But more importantly, I think the question on the weapons of mass destruction is not the most relevant in the region. The one that's most relevant is the chemical weapons. Because even though like the nuclear option is always in the background when we talk about Iran, but chemical weapons are the weapons that have been actually used by several actors of the region in the history. And in Syria, most recently, this has been one of the main causes where Obama was about to intervene in Syria. So I think for a more thorough analysis of how international actors are looking at weapons of mass destruction, I think the focus on the use of chemical weapons in the region could give us more insight and a more holistic pattern on what is actually triggering a reaction or not a reaction in the region. In terms of alliances, I think one of the major consequences of the Iraq war has been the polarization in the region. Initially, the decade after the war, we've seen the region divided between the resistance or the so-called resistance axis between Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas, and on the other side, there was Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. And obviously, this kind of divide has become even more complicated after 2011, because it's not just about these two, it's also about the UAE, it's also about Saudi Arabia having different plans, having different ambitions in the region. Definitely, the signal that the US is no longer interested in intervening directly made other partners seem more reliable, or somewhat could be involved with regional actors. Russia, for example, found a door through which to come back to the Middle East after the Cold War, even though the first decade after the Cold War, Russia had absolutely no influence whatsoever in regional politics, but somewhat Russia is now finding back a door through the Syria conflict, but also through supporting other and opening the channels of conversation with other actors in the region, like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt. It became very clear when Russia invaded Ukraine, most of the reaction of many Arab governments didn't really condemn Russia, as opposed to the European overwhelming position against Russia. And that in itself is telling about how Russia as well is becoming more of a partner for some Arab states and for Iran as well. So in a way, regional actors started looking beyond the US to rely on other actors in the region, which even created more polarization. And in the end, one of the main consequences is that our non-state actors became partners. It started with them being proxies, but they actually became reliable partners for some countries. Syria depended on Hezbollah more than Hezbollah depended on Syria at times. So this partnership is also a very reliable alliance that we can look at as an example of the consequences. And finally, the multipolarity in the region is one of the major implications that we can look at. Even those alliances have been changing, shifting. The main feature here is that there is no actor, even an axis, is able to dominate the Middle East. So somewhat there is the breaking down of the region, the breaking down of that balance of power. There is no actor that's able to dominate or become hegemon, even a global partner or a local partner. So alliances will continue, and that's the only way for some state to achieve some of their goals.
And first of all, I agree with the fact that the issue of weapons of mass destruction was used, if you would, as a justification, and particularly in terms of both rallying public opinion in the West in support of the war, but also getting a critical United Nations votes to authorize the war. I think that is no longer possible. So that ability to use weapons of mass destruction as an excuse for war was a one-time tool that the United States used it cynically, and then because it went so wrong, it's no longer convincing. So, and we can see it. In practice, weapons of mass destruction are not compelling. So Assad can use it in Syria with impunity. Again, the United States went to the brink of war, and then President Obama did exactly what Trump did with Iran and the shooting down of the drone, used an excuse that Congress won't vote, and backed away from essentially getting the United States into the Syria war. And then with Iran, we can see after everything with the JCPOA, post-JCPOA, as we're talking, the United States and Iran have arrived at least at some point where Iran is now enriching upwards of 60% uranium, and there is no war. The threat after threat after threat that Israel will attack, the United States will attack. All options are on the table. All options are on the table, but they will not be exercised. I mean, that's basically where it is. So that no longer, I think, is playing in that way. And if I were to look into the future, I think Iran at best will be at the current level that it is, but more likely it will actually continue to sort of get to a threshold state. And in fact, the only reason it may not would be out of consideration for its relations with its neighbor rather than the United States. Just to add to, again, excellent points that were made on regional security. I mean, I think, this is an era that the whole thing is up for debate. And I mean, first of all, one issue is that what is regional security in the Middle East? It's actually not very clear that there is a one way of looking at it. Even like a few years ago, there was an argument that Israel and Saudi Arabia and the United States, they all see a very clear anti-Iran sort of a tight alliance. But now, at least Saudi Arabia has basically made that line a lot grayer. and it's not on the same position. So, we'll have to pay a lot more attention the way these, as was mentioned, these major multipolar centers in the region actually see their security. So what is security for Saudi Arabia? What is security for Iran? What is security for Turkey, for each of these countries? It's not as clear cut, number one. And so I think it's a very interesting time to pay attention to the region more than to Washington. And also it's also time for the region to get engaged a lot more in dialogue among themselves at various levels, think tanks, intellectuals, universities, to help define sort of what might be common ground for it. Is if we're going to get to where Barham Saleh said, where Europe got to, in other words, to try to understand a common security on the continent, this has to start at an intellectual, academic level, and this is the time for it. And thirdly, I would say it's the first time where the region is not recipient of a Washington vision, right? I mean, you clearly see it in Saudi Arabia. They just don't buy into the fact that we're going to come here and tell you who your enemy is and how this is going to play out, right? They basically have their own theory. And in fact, Washington, from where I sit, is very clearly doesn't understand and doesn't know and continuously has to second guess. They go there, they think they have an agreement on oil, they come back and they see that Saudis actually may have a more common ground with Russia than they do with Washington, or UAE does not want to play ball on Ukraine the way that Washington wants, right? So, I mean, these are very important. It's not just to say that they are snobbing Washington. This is actually the wrong way to think of it. The right way to think of it is that these countries actually have a very clear sense of what's their national interest, and they are pursuing it, and they're not recipient of Washington's thinking. And lastly, I would say, and this is something that, where I sit in Washington, I see it's very gradually dawning on Americans, is that, in many ways, the United States is outsider to some of these relationships. So Iran has a tight relationship with China and Russia. The Saudis have a tight relationship with China and a very good relationship with Russia, if not that tight. And there's a lot more, if you want to say, Venn diagrams in the region that are overlapping. And it's no longer as clear that these countries are clearly aligned against one another in the way they were before. In other words, Iranian-Saudi dynamic in both capitals involves a Chinese and a Russian dimension. And there are conversations that happen which we don't know at all between Riyadh and Beijing, between Riyadh and Tehran. I mean, we saw the role that Xi Jinping played didn't fall completely out of the sky. It fell because there's a set of relationships that were there that we usually didn't think about it. We thought about the Middle East as basically an American domain. It's for America to think what security is there, what it wants to do, and it's going to define it for the region. And so, in a way, the Middle East is probably the most multipolar area of the world, much more so, I would say, than Africa or any other area of the developing world. And I think that's, at least academically, to me, that's fascinating. Because, aside from what it means practically, it's a completely new game, if you will.
Okay, so let me take my role here as the chair to ask a personal follow-up question. We know that, as you mentioned, the justification for the weapons of mass destruction, but we also saw the justification, as some of you also discussed, of course, America spreading its freedom to the rest of the world. As an historian of the United States, of course, I discuss this with my students, this kind of way in which the United States has used the myth of American exceptionalism to try to spread its values going back over 100 years. In what way is that myth completely destroyed now after the war in Iraq? Will that ever be another form of soft power for the United States?
Well, I think as we're standing, there is more than just the war in Iraq. I think the war in Iraq included a great deal of cynicism in it that probably made it inviable in this region, if you would. First of all, the idea that you're going to pursue democracy through the barrel of a gun, it was problematic. The fact that the United States could not construct the fundamental institutions on the basis of which democracy has to function, namely a functioning state, was problematic. Secondly, that the region, actually, people in the region who were supposed to be the audience for the American policy did not buy into it, and in fact rejected it. And then when there was a moment, if you were to say that the people in the region rose up, if you would, in demand for dignity, et cetera, for Arab Spring, the United States was a no-show, right? It didn't, as was mentioned, get involved in Syria. In Libya, it was only lead from behind, as they said. We support European air campaign and no more. So it became much like the weapons of mass destruction. It was seen as a cynical argument for going into Iraq and no more. But, you could also say that the Iraq war also unraveled democracy in America in many ways. Because, there are people who trace the rise of Trumpism, populism, the attack on America's own democratic institutions back to the Iraq war. The cynicism within the American military and the American military community about the logic of putting him in harm's way, launching wars that were lost, if you would, people that they lost in these wars and for what, actually has created that. If you look at the number of people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, or have joined these radical groups, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, etc., the number of veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan is actually quite staggering, which says that, yes, there is not a question of accountability. We had yesterday, it's not the same way. If you're going to put somebody in front of a Nuremberg trial, that didn't happen. But it's not like the United States got away scot-free from this. There was a blowback that wasn't recognized. And now that you look back at it 20 years, you could see that it actually did a tremendous amount of damage. And so I don't think it flies anymore. I mean, it just reminds me of the first meeting that the Biden administration had with the Chinese in Alaska, and as soon as they started talking about human rights in China, the Chinese foreign minister said, "Don't talk to us about democracy. Your own people no longer believe in it." Right, and so I think it's going to take some time before the United States can exert that kind of authority again.
If ever.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I think this idea of America spreading its values, it's not very particular to the US. Every hegemon, every imperialist power throughout history had this idea as well of spreading its model and believing that its model is more superior than other models in other regions. And obviously, the kind of values that many of the Americans believed in, or Europeans, or the West, it never flew in the Arab world, even before the Iraq War. Arabs never believed that America was coming to the Middle East to bring freedom and democracy. And that's where all the conspiracy theories found like a very fertile ground in the region, because there was never a belief that the US is just here to spread its values. So that was never perceived by the people as a genuine sort of mission. But more importantly, this exactly kind of spreading of model led to the anti-Americanism that came the 2 decades later, and that was the kind of normal reaction to someone spreading certain ideas, and there's a counter resistance to those ideas. And again, there's nothing unique about this. Anyone would try to spread certain ideas, there will be a counter movement. And obviously, different actors in the region had that sort of resistance in different form. Some in Islamism, some in not believing in anything. But overall, this kind of mission was never perceived by people in the region as a genuine one. But after the failure of the Iraq War and after the Arab uprising, it became even more dismissed by the people. And looking now at the Arab uprisings, I mean, if we remember the main slogan, عيش حرية عدالة اجتماعية, the first thing that people were asking for was the bread, which is the economic reforms, which people wanted a better life. And even when they said freedom, they had a totally different interpretation of what freedom is. in the Middle East. And therefore, people didn't listen, like they said something, but the decision makers, either in the Arab world or outside, they were not listening. If we look at all the reactions to the Arab uprisings, either in the Arab world or globally, they were more about political reforms. Like the year after the uprising, people were saying economic reforms. Europe, the US, politician talking about political reforms. So there was a total disconnect from what the people wanted and what the people said and all the reactions from all the parties involved. And now, 10 years later, after the uprising, the economy is worse than ever in every single Arab country. All Arab countries are reaching, or except the Gulf, they're reaching bankruptcy. So we're talking about serious economic issues that the people cared about, but the message from the outside was totally different. There was no listening to the people. So when the US now talking about freedom or promotion of democracy, there is really no resonance whatsoever because of all of this history and all of this events that our generation and even younger generation have been going through. So if we talk now, and I've been having conversation with friends and people that I know all over the Arab world, people no longer want democracy. Democracy has just brought more repression, more authoritarianism, civil wars. So people simply in the region do not believe in democracy. So we just need a different model at some point.
Well, I'm a historian too, and in a sense, the exhaustion that we've talked about in terms of the US lack of appetite and desire for military action, we saw that in the late 70s after Vietnam. And actually, in the run up to the Gulf War in 1991, there was a lot of debate, a lot of angst as to whether this would be another Vietnam, whether there would be thousands or tens of thousands of casualties, people coming back in body bags on a huge scale. So it's nothing new. Of course, what changed, as I think May mentioned, was the overwhelming success of Desert Storm, especially the ground war component, driving Saddam's forces out of Kuwait in 4 days. Then, of course, the Kosovo campaign in 1999, illustrating, at least from a theoretical perspective, that you could achieve certain objectives through bombing from the air without having boots on the ground. The revolution of military affairs that was talked about a lot at the end of the century, at the turn of the century. And then, of course, 9/11, for all the highly problematic linkages that were then drawn between 9/11 and Saddam Hussein and Iraq, for all those linkages, 9/11 did provide the seismic shock and context for the atmosphere within which the notion that something had to be done took root. So I think we've been here before, in a sense. History never repeats, but it does rhyme. And again, just picking up on what Vali said about the sort of erosion of democracy in the US, we saw something broadly comparable in the UK, where Iraq was the beginning of a sense of the withdrawal of trust from the public in the political class. And we then had other issues such as the global financial crisis, a sense that there was a lack of accountability, and we spoke about the lack of accountability yesterday. And then a very specific British issue, which was a major parliamentary expenses scandal in 2009, where a lot of members of parliament were found to be irregularly claiming expenses. We saw a whole process of a series of events where elites and experts were distrusted, which in my view led to the referendum decision to leave the European Union in 2016. So we did see a lot of the impacts, perhaps not on the scale of the storming of the Capitol in terms of actually physical violence, but certainly equally consequential decisions as a result of the aftermath of the decision in 2003 and the ways in which it went wrong.
Okay, another anonymous question from the audience. Dr. Vali Nasser mentioned that the U.S. role is diminishing in regional security due to various reasons. But do you think that the region will be safer or better with an unknown player like China entering?
Well, I think it depends on different countries' national interests. I mean, you know, the point is that obviously the United States is not willing to provide security for many countries. I think you made the point that, you know, that there's increasingly skepticism about, you know, U.S.'s support for countries in the region. Just because U.S. has troops in the region, just because it has bases, if it's not willing to use them when après happens, if it's not willing to use them in different occasions, it does not provide security at all. So there has to, I mean, there has to be a different sort of way in which the region gets the security it wants. And I think that's the interesting point. The way we used to think in a default way that the United States is here, it will provide security, is no longer a given. And therefore, the region has to figure out new ways to achieve that security.
Well, I think I always find predictions very hard. So predicting what is going to happen in the future, usually the reality is much more complex and it's much more dramatic than our imagination of what the future may unfold. But obviously the fact that these, definitely China, until now, China has some interest in the region, but it has been very much limited to economic projects until recently when they mediated this kind of not a cooperation, but just an initial sort of type of cooperation agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Until then, China seemed completely uninterested in the politics of the Middle East. So it's very hard to know how China over time will frame its foreign policy, will shape its agenda when it comes to the region. But for, let's say, the next few years, again, the Middle East, or for the very first time in a very long time, external actors are uninterested in shaping the Middle East. And that in itself is providing some sort of a natural environment for regional actors to compete and to rise naturally in what could be a balance of power in the future, or rather a balance of weakness, and we see it at the moment. But overall, this is the first time in the history. Europe had a similar dynamic in the 18th, 19th century, which led eventually to what we see at the moment, and Charles Tilly's famous quote about state make war and war makes the state. Somewhat this competition and this rivalry that exist in the region, and if it evolves naturally without external intervention, maybe we will have a natural evolution of Middle East state system in the region.
Yeah, I think it's probably going to be something that unfolds over the long term in terms of how China perceives its interests in the region and how they align or don't align with other perceptions as well. But what we have seen, and I just think that 2019 in Abqaiq changed everything, and what we saw, especially after the killing of Qasem Soleimani in January 2020, we saw the Saudis sending Khalid bin Salman to Washington to make the case in person for de-escalation. We saw the UAE come out with very strong statements that now is not the time for another war in the Gulf. We saw the Saudis and the UAE make separate, which I think is also interesting in itself. They didn't coordinate, but they made their own separate outreach to Iran, directly in the UAE case, indirectly through intermediaries in the Saudi case, culminating in China, the Chinese approach. And we've seen just really this whole strategic context and environment shift. And we saw that in March this year when there was a series of coordinated, and I would say strategic leaks to US media that seemed to suggest the price the Saudis would demand for normalization with Israel, which has now become, it seems, the sort of main singular Biden administration objective in terms of Middle East policy for this remainder of this term. But the very following day, we actually did see Saudi normalization, but not with Israel, but with Iran, and using China as a conduit to not only deliver, but underwrite that normalization. And I think that really sends a powerful message that, especially for the next few years, and especially for Saudi Arabia and for Mohammed bin Salman, it's all about de-risking his neighborhood so that he can focus resolutely on Vision 2030, on delivering the giga projects, which were going to be much more difficult if you had the threat of Iranian or of Houthi missiles and drones slamming into the areas where he was trying to attract international tourism. Of course, the image for the Saudis that they want to avoid was the image in 2022, in March 2022, when we had the Formula One Grand Prix taking place in Jeddah, in the backdrop of black smoke billowing from a fuel depot that had been hit the day before by a Houthi missile. And so this is all about de-risking. It's about focusing on economic growth, on economic interests, and China, of course, is a key part of that. And so I think that's at least where we are for the next few years.
Okay, I'm going to adapt a question from Zarka in the audience because you've addressed some of that. So some of you have discussed the impact on American democracy of the war in Iraq. To what extent has the U.S. public perception about the Iraqi invasion shifted with regards to its understanding of war crimes? And I assume she means American war crimes and the disastrous consequences, right? So are we seeing the American public more aware of what the United States did in Iraq?
I mean, the simple answer is no, because it's not a big part of the media debate. But I would say usually, I mean, I don't know of any historical cases when a country essentially looks at war crimes in its own country. It's usually, you do these things to people you defeat. I mean, I mean, I don't know of any historical cases that a country has actually, created a Nuremberg trial for its own people. So that's what happened in Vietnam, unless you have a public debate about this, unless there's actual numbers, there's a set of issues there. Ironically, as I said, it is within actually the veteran community, much more than in the general public, because they actually saw it firsthand and they understood it much, much better. But for this, even during Vietnam, there was a segment of American politicians who picked up that cause. I mean, there were hearings in senates, et cetera, about the conduct of the war. That hasn't happened in the US. So there is no, if you would, galvanization of public opinion the way you had in England to have a war report. So the short answer is no, it hasn't happened.
Yeah, I would just only add to that somewhat the US public is much more focused on domestic, and somewhat as Middle East experts and scholars, we are more interested in the US foreign policy. But looking even like at the elections in the US, the foreign policy is not one of the major deciders for how people vote. And that in itself can give you a bit of an idea about whether this debate is even important at the domestic level or not. But I would also agree that it's all about the soldiers and it's all about the losses of US lives that has been caused by the war, but there is no discussion about, okay, the Iraq was destroyed, Iraqi people suffered, or people in the region suffered. I don't think this has been, at least I haven't come across any of that.
Favorite topic of Hollywood film. Okay, so I know, May, that you don't like to talk about the future, but we have another anonymous question. Where could Iraq, and I think this probably is our last question, where could Iraq stand on a global stage in 20 years?
Well, I think in 20 years from now, Iraq will have 2 generations of individuals, people that grew up post-Saddam. I think already we're seeing a generation, and we saw this with the protest movement in 2019 and afterwards, a generation coming of age who do not want to do politics the old ways, who see no point of continuity with a system they don't recognize, the system that was really brought into being after 2003, still less with the system that preceded 2003. So if Iraq can regain its status as a major pillar within a wider regional order, I think that will be something that will obviously be welcome. I think it could certainly be a huge undertaking, but I also believe that the people in Iraq, who the longer we go away from 2003 and its consequences, I think they will demand change. And the extent to which that change will be resisted, I think, will determine a lot of how the political future develops.
Well, thank you for the question. The main reason I don't really like to talk about predictions and the future because I'm not very optimistic. I heard lots of optimistic remarks yesterday about the future of Iraq, the future of the region. I'm very pessimistic, unfortunately. So in the next 20 years, I don't really see things improving. I see more crises, economic crises, more climate change crises, and I also see more emboldened regional actors to pursue risky policies. So looking, for example, at the UAE, one of the main strategies that they have developed after 2011 was more supporting secessionist movements in the region as a way of finding influence in some areas. This will have long-term consequences on some of the conflicts in the region. So in that sense, they're opening doors that might have long-term implications, and most of the policies that I've seen from decision makers in the region, that they're very short-sighted, and that worries me a lot. So looking at 20 years, I'm not very optimistic, unfortunately.
I have to share that view. I'm not terribly optimistic either. And I think one of the tragedies about the sort of the security environment that the Middle East found itself in the past 20 years is that for governments, for people, they took their eyes off of what are some fundamental economic changes and that they needed to do. And therefore, this region is actually behind the curve from many other areas of the world in terms of addressing those issues. And then when you look at indicators, particularly in Iraq, nothing is positive. The population's growing, the government's corrupt, the institutions are weak. The right investments in society are not made. And then also on top of it, you now have serious climate issues that are adding with water shortages, with heat, et cetera. And you don't see, despite a lot of talking, you really don't see any sort of positive impulse to actually how are you going to change the fundamental dynamic in these societies. And it's not just Iraq. You could say the same thing about a whole host of countries around this region, other than where there is a surfeit of, if you would, petrodollars, and the social economic indicators in the region are not good. And so I just don't see an easy path to somewhere better for the region.
So I gave away my final question, and we actually still have 15 minutes left. So let me go back to some of the questions from the audience. John, one of our students from GUQ, what could the lessons of the Iraq War tell us of U.S. counterterrorism, that toppling dictatorships leads to power vacuums becoming havens for terrorists, for example?
Well, I would say at the very beginning, the war fighting part was very easy and successful, as was mentioned. It was what happened after you arrived successfully in Baghdad that became an issue. And so it's really about reconstruction. And then, yes, the United States may have thought that by 2006, it was able to find a way to make peace with the Sunni insurgency and then to be able to contain the situation, negotiate some kind of a political settlement to get out. But then that model was not replicable in Afghanistan. And in a way, I think that the main lesson is just not to get involved. I think there was no satisfactory solution. I mean, to getting out of Iraq. And then, the idea that you could build a local military that could take over from you, it didn't work in Iraq and it didn't work in Afghanistan either. And so I don't think there are any good lessons here for the United States to take away. That this was really a war in which there was anything successful that came out of it. Even the counterinsurgency that General Petraeus prided himself on died in Afghanistan. It didn't succeed. So in a way, I would say Iraq is also a sort of a important turning point for U.S. military thinking as well.
Yeah, I think in a way, the breaking down of states that we've seen in the region have followed more or less the same scenarios. So vacuum of power, relying on militias, and then these militias turn against their initial sponsors, and there's a devolution of violence. We have crises of migration, we have economic problems, and it's kind of the same story over and over again. So this idea of learning, somehow it didn't happen. We've seen it first in Afghanistan, second in Iraq, we've seen it in Syria, we've seen it in Yemen, we've seen it in Libya. Now in Sudan even, there's actually no learning curve whatsoever, but it is kind of expected. If you break down the institutions in any state, it's expected that groups will take arms for security, but also for resources, controlling resources. And again, there's nothing peculiar about the Middle East in this regard. Any state in any other region that's breaking down will have to go through the same process. But the question then becomes, and I think that hasn't been talked about enough, if this is happening, who keeps the arms flow to these groups? And again, we're going to go back to the same problem again, that even though the US is not really interested in acting or willing, but they remain a main supplier of arms in the region, along with the EU, and that is a huge problem. So even though they're not really fighting, but they're keeping the conditions of the war alive. And that is a big problem, and we're living with the consequences of these kind of choices. And more importantly, at some point, these groups that being supplied with arms, they will start attacking their sponsors, and it happened before. So it's the same story over and over again. So the question is, what do we do about that?
Well, I mean, it seems like what you're saying is that people should really be listening to historians quite a bit more, right?
You said that.
Speaking of which.
I completely agree with you on that. But I think part of the policy conundrum and part of the general sense of people now in the US and the UK just not knowing what to do, in a sense, is that we've seen these vacuums in Iraq, where we intervened full scale. We've seen the vacuum in Libya, where we intervened from behind and then took our eyes off the ball. And we've seen it in Syria, where we didn't intervene at all. And so I think there's a sense that there's no, I think people just, especially officials, from having seen these vacuums develop in so many different ways, there's just a general incomprehension about what to do, what not to do. But again, it all flows, I think, from the decision in 2003 and all the various consequences which structured the perceptions for the later interventions or lack of, and the way they developed.
So I have a question that hasn't come up yet from Hamad. What do you think about the policy of de-Baathification and its influence on the new Iraqi political system after the US-led invasion in 2003?
Well, I mean, I think if there's a whole, we can have a whole debate about who is responsible more than most for so many of the decisions that went wrong, but certainly I think Paul Bremer is probably high among those on that list, and certainly the decision to de-Baathify to the extent that they went, all the way down to much more junior levels, was a disastrous one for multiple reasons, not least because it really made enemies of so many people within Iraq who could have been perhaps otherwise co-opted, and also the disbanding of the army as well. It just really, from the very beginning, set the coalition occupying forces on the back foot. And once they abandoned that sort of early optimism from the fact that they'd taken Saddam out in 3 weeks, and as we heard from this morning, the sort of people in Fallujah, especially at the beginning, were not hostile. This was dropped. This was ceded straight away, and there was a kind of almost, they could never catch up again. So I think it was a disaster.
Yeah, I think on the de-Baathification, I think there's always this distinction that we as social scientists of the region, we're constantly unable to get rid of, the difference between the regime and the state in the Middle East. And in Arabic, both words are called nizam, but actually in English, the distinction is very clear. The state, which are the institutions, which are more durable, and the regime is more the elites in power and their networks. And ideally, in a democratic system, that the state with its institution are durable and there is an alteration of power of regimes. The way the Middle East states have evolved and have been consolidated is through the consolidation of regimes. So it's very hard to make this distinction between the regime and the state. And in many, many cases, we've seen where the regime has actually captured the state and even made the state completely or we are unable to dissociate the regime from the state. And that was very visible during the Syria war, that somehow, with the collapse of the regime, the state is also collapsing. And it was the same for Iraq. De-Baathification or dismantling the regime meant also dismantling the state. And I think that is the problem that we're facing in the region, that we don't really have this distinction like in the 16th century. The 16th, said, l'état c'est moi, and that's all the regimes in Egypt, l'état c'est moi, the state is me. And I think that is the problem. And unless we're somehow seeing a path where the institutions are more or less distinct from the regimes and the elite in power, we're always risking that dismantling a regime, removing an elite, will be destroying the state itself.
Okay, so then now let me move to the last question. So going from a war that has lasted 20 years to another conflict that has gone for over 100 years, a question from Vefa at Qatar University. To what extent has the Iraq War affected Arab-Israeli normalization, including, of course, the Abraham Accords?
Well, I think as Vali said, it kind of hastened the shift in gravity in the Middle East towards the Gulf. Certainly what we've seen with the Abraham Accords is that for some countries in the region that have normalized with Israel more recently, the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, as they see it, is no longer the main fissure within Middle East politics or geopolitics. We certainly saw with the impact of the war in Iraq and the sort of empowerment of Iran, as was seen in Arab capitals. We saw a sense in UAE and Saudi Arabia, in Israel, that they were drawing closer on certain issues geopolitically, vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis non-state actors, Islamist groups, that these points of convergence were greater than some of the issues that had historically kept them divided. And then, of course, we had the JCPOA, the secret negotiations in Oman, which in 2012, 2013, and the fact that then the Gulf states and Israel were both excluded from the subsequent JCPOA process. We saw a sense that that convergence of interest was there, and that on the big picture issues of the 21st century rather than the 20th century, there was that space to think about a new criteria of relationships with states like Israel. So I think, although there wasn't maybe a direct link, it was certainly the impact of the consequences of the invasion and the ways it changed the geopolitics of the Middle East created that space within which normalization could take place in the way it did.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think sometimes it's very helpful to think in counterfactuals, in the sense, okay, if the Iraq War hadn't happened, how would the Arab-Israeli conflict now look like? And then it would be very hard to imagine, for example, the axis of Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah, for example, having supported Hamas. Or it's very hard to imagine that somehow Israel would be having relationship with other Gulf countries with Iraq somehow staying intact. And I think these counterfactuals sometimes may be useful in looking at the impact of particular events. But overall, the Iraq War, again, it did change some of the structural conditions. And one of these structural conditions that some Arab states are simply uninterested in being invested in the Arab-Israeli conflict. They just simply have other priorities. They have an Iraq that's divided and full of problems. They have Iran that's growing in its influence in the region. And they also have weakening Arab states like Egypt, for example, that they couldn't really rely on. So I think the conditions changed and the priorities changed, and therefore normalization was somehow an option and on the table.
I would just add, I mean, sometimes looking at it in a sort of a longer frame, you would say the outcome of the Iraq war at one level was the rise of Iran. Iran was a big winner of the Iraq war. And it was also the realization that the United States essentially has exhausted itself. So these two things would have suggested that UAE and Bahrain and potentially Saudi Arabia would look to different kind of alliances. But also, it's also a question of opportunity. That for UAE, there were also much more approximate reasons why they would do this at that particular point in time. There's also a question of changing the generational change in the leadership of these countries. I mean, people continuously write in Washington that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia will only recognize Israel after his father passes away, that he belongs to a generation that does not want his fingerprints on, quote unquote, settling the Palestinian issue in this manner. Or King Abdullah was particularly perturbed by Israeli IDF's handling of the Palestinians. So you have a younger generation that no longer is beholden to old Arab politics. But also importantly, is the Abraham Accords didn't just come after the Iraq war, it also came after Arab Spring. It came after also Libya and Syria being knocked out, if you would, as those bastions of old Arab politics after the rise of ISIS and everything else that it entailed. So and also the fact that I think there was a calculation, even though they have very small populations by UAE and Bahrain, that a normalization with Israel will not have an effect on the Arab street, their own street or on Arab street. So why is it that the Arab street did not rise in Egypt or, first of all, there was no Damascus or Baghdad at that point in time, because the mind of the Arab street was somewhere else. It was about the issues of dignity, jobs, etc., that Mai mentioned that came up with Arab Spring. So there's a perception that the Arab Spring basically shifted what is a priority for Arabs. It's not democracy, it's not Arab-Israel issue, top priorities, food, jobs, dignity. And therefore, you're not going to get the kind of pro-Palestinian reaction, if you would. And so there's a moment in time when it was an opportunity to do this without necessarily feeling a backlash. They're not major Arab states that can create a resistance front like they did with Sadat in 1970s. And the Arab street, his mind is also somewhere else. It's licking its wounds from Arab Spring. And I mean, we might still be in that moment. That's why even though there's talk of normalization between Riyadh and Washington, and even though the Israeli government is now much more aggressive on settlements, on anti-Palestinian issues, we're just not seeing the kind of street reaction that you might anticipate in opposition to even flirting with this idea at this point in time. It's all about who gets what for making this deal, as opposed to what the Palestinians get. Right? That's kind of like absent in the conversation, which tells you that sort of that these leaders may calculate that right now they pay the least amount of political cost for making that decision.
That's fascinating, given that we're in a time in the United States where the American public is increasingly unwilling to support Israeli apartheid, right?
Exactly.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone. And let's please give a final round of applause to our